Of course, we're now well into the offseason, looking ahead to the draft, expansion draft, free agency. Now that we're a couple weeks removed from the Montreal series, we've all kind of done our own personal autopsy on the club and what happened. Now we've had a little bit of time. I mean, looking back, have you made sense about what happened to the Jets in that series?
I mean, I don't know that I've arrived at a brand new piece of wisdom. I think that the trick to this season, well before the playoffs, was going to be not to overreact too much to the highs and lows. Just because on the human side of it, I think there is so much that made the year unique. And I have time for the argument that the team staying together and having a tight room and all of those things is a remarkable accomplishment given the structure of the year. But when you start analyzing it hockey-wise, I don't want to get too high on the Winnipeg Jets for Connor McDavid having a pretty similar expected goals rate against them in the playoffs in 4 straight losses as he did during the regular season, nor do I want to get too low on them for getting swept by a very good Montreal Canadiens team whose forecheck they just couldn't figure out, pass their way around, couldn't match the speed, couldn't find a moving route that was going to lead to success. And I continue to go back to against Montreal this idea that we talk and talk and talk about get to the middle of the ice. And, it must be, Ben Sherratt and Shea Weber. And that's why Winnipeg was unable to generate offense against those guys. But for me, hockey is so unbelievably linked. And I just go back to this idea that you can't go to the front of the net unless you have a reasonable belief that the puck is going to get there too. And I think that spoke to an issue that wasn't just a small sample size thing, and that's puck transition for the Winnipeg Jets. And I think that's something, whether it's defensive personnel, whether it's bringing in the young guys, whether Ville Heinola is ready to take a lead in that, or free agency trades, whatever it's going to be, or new ideas systemically. And I don't know what those are to bring to you and say, hey, I've got the answers, or else I'd be a much richer person. There are issues moving the puck up ice, gaining the zone, having that possession, and then being able to do something with it that justifies that trip to the net in the end, at the end of all of that. So I think that's where I think I'll spend some time sort of trying to dig into over the course of the summer.
Well, just on that, because I'd mentioned it, and I think we spoke about it beforehand. I mean, to me, the biggest difference from the Edmonton series to the Montreal series was exactly that, transition and puck management, basically, when it comes down to it. I mean, the ability to make a simple pass, to make the right decision, to do it effectively and quickly and move it out. And I don't know, I thought the Jets did that very well for the most part against the Edmonton Oilers, and that didn't happen at all against Montreal. And I guess the question is, how much did that have to do credit to Montreal with the way they forecheck, and how big of a absence was Dylan DeMelo in the Montreal series, and how much did that contribute to the problems the Jets had in their own end, Murat?
Well, the answer's got to be a lot, but I mean, exactly pinpointing it, I'm not sure, because like you say, when you start talking about that transition, Dylan DeMelo's name was in the back of my mind leading up to you mentioning it, because I think dealing with fast forechecks and heavy forechecks, as much as we talk about size and things like that, I think there's a speed of decision making and an efficacy of that puck movement that sometimes gets lost in a guy like Dylan DeMelo, who's not an enormous player, he's not a bruising player, he's not an incredibly fast player to move foot speed-wise, but he does make the shoulder check, process where everybody is. And the one thing I like, or that I always go back to about defensemen whose games I really like, is when they make that reverse pass or when they make a pass to their partner in their own zone, are they putting that partner in more pressure than they were in a second ago? Or are they putting them in less with an outlet, with a place to go with it? And I think that Dylan DeMelo, perhaps more than any other Winnipeg Jets defenseman, consistently puts his partner in good spots. And that 5% improvement in the landscape of a breakout, if that's not too strange a way to think of it, for me is his calling card and his specialty. And it's an area that Winnipeg, its defense, certainly when you're playing, a sub 1 million player in Tucker Pullman on the top pairing, or Derek Forbert, who was almost a reclamation project, and that he'd had injury issues and things like that in the top 4. They don't have the payroll of a juggernaut, so we shouldn't expect them to have the performance necessarily of a juggernaut. So there's lots of different aspects of the game you can point to and say they should be better in. But I think that puck management that you mentioned is number one for me first and foremost, and it might take a rethinking of what kinds of skill sets work in this NHL. And I think Dylan DeMelo the numbers bear it out. Whenever he was with Josh Morrissey, I mean, they had better numbers than Morrissey with anybody else. And so I think there's a lot to that.
Well, and you know what? There's a couple of your recent pieces I wanted to get to, but I may as well. I believe it was last week you put out the 6 predictions for the Jets next season based on kind of what we heard in the season-ending interviews from Paul Maurice and Kevin Cheveldayoff. And let's focus on that defense. I mean, you know, from where we're at right now, and things can change very quickly, and, you know, we're really get these answers in the next couple months when it comes to machinations in and around the expansion draft, free agency, any potential trades. But that being said, Murat, how different do you think this Jets blue line looks next season? And based on that, how different is that the priority, first of all, for the club? And what sort of changes do you anticipate may or may not be happening? Because we certainly know from a fan standpoint, we've heard, you know, everyone wants to see Ville Heinola. Where's Dylan Sandberg? Everyone's fallen in love with Logan Stanley. But, you know, having that many young defensemen on the same blue line is a challenge, I think, at times. And we all know how Paul Maurice sometimes will lean on a veteran player over a younger player, you know, for significant minutes.
Yeah, and I like that you added Logan Stanley's name at the end there, because, like, to continue talking a little bit about puck management, Logan Stanley in training camp in December, January, what month was that? The thing that I noticed, which made me write, I think, 2 or 3 times during training camp, that he is for real, watch out, like there's something going on here, was not the fact that he was 6'7" and crushing people. It was the fact he was making puck retrievals and putting his partners in good situations. So there's something to like there moving forward. How much to like? What kind of cornerstone does he become or not become? I mean, the big debate expansion draft wise could be between Stanley and DeMelo, if you assume Josh Morrissey and Neil Pionk are the 2 givens. And I think that the degree of difference we see probably starts with Winnipeg taking care of its business in-house first. And by that, I mean Neil Pionk is a restricted free agent with arbitration rights, 2 years away from unrestricted free agency eligibility. So if he goes to arbitration, they can't find a long-term deal. Great. The Jets will choose 1 year for arbitration. It'll be a tough situation next summer, but, you know, he's in the fold. That's not an emergency. Andrew Kopp, on the other hand, arbitration rights, 1 year from unrestricted free agency eligibility. If he elects for arbitration, the Jets can't find, and if the Jets can't find a long-term solution to that, well, then there's a situation there where arbitration would walk him to unrestricted free agency next summer. So does that become an asset that you then explore moving? Is there a defenseman that can come back for that? I don't know. I think the Jets would just like to sign the guy long term. But it's an example to me of Winnipeg needing to take care of its business in-house before then step 2 of that in-house business would be the expansion draft. And we're going to see the landscape shift a couple of times before I think they can get into those major moves. And I know I've read fans, you know, speculate about Dougie Hamilton or, you know, some of the free agents available, like a David Savard type or other sorts of things like this. I think Winnipeg is prioritizing upgrading the top 4. I think that upgrading the defense is the number 1 priority. I asked Paul Maurice, you know, how are you going to manage Heinola, Sandberg, and Stanley in the same lineup as once? And he kind of deflected, saying, hey, I don't think we're going to expect that. The bigger question might be, who's the best partner for Josh Morrissey? My answer is Dylan DeMelo. But clearly the answer is, I think, number 1 in the organization's mind is top 4 upgrades of some kind. But what shape that takes, how good the player, what kind of assets, probably starts with a Neil Pionk signing and an Andrew Kopp signing as well, and all that other sort of stuff. It's kind of how I'm reading the landscape.
Yeah, and you know, listen, any of these conversations we're having right now at the end of June have to happen within the context of a 32nd team coming in and an expansion draft. And, you know, there's a couple things to that, Murat. One, you know you're going to lose a player or have to make some sort of a deal. An asset will be going to Seattle. But for a team like the Jets, you know, once we see the unprotected list from around the league and see players that potentially are available to Seattle, we cannot forget about the potential of sort of a 3-way deal where Seattle's taking a guy that's available and maybe moving them on. I mean, Vegas, didn't they take like a dozen defensemen at that point? And then 4 or 5 of them were not on the Vegas Golden Knights roster by the time that the season began. And it did seem like Vegas at the time prioritized the blue line, albeit at the same time, they still came away with Alex Tuck and Marchessault and Riley Smith and Hall and all these other players on it. But I do think that there'll be some interesting possibilities for general managers like Kevin Cheveldayoff to maybe take care of something on their to-do list before we even get to free agency through some creative working with a guy like Ron Francis?
Well, that's a great point, because one of the things that I'm guessing without knowing is going to change a little bit between this expansion draft and last is I think a lot of NHL teams felt a little burned by the amount of assets they gave up to protect their guys necessarily, right? So, I think Winnipeg made a really strong and defensible choice to make sure it kept its top four defense. I bring up the example of trading first round picks with Vegas more just to point out that there's consequences, not to criticize it, because Toby Enstrom was an important part of 2017, 2018 Winnipeg Jets success. Nobody was harder to generate chances against than that Enstrom-Bufflin pairing. They were, I think, top 3 or 4 in the league in that regard. It was just an amazing year for those guys. However, it came with the price of now watching Nick Suzuki have all kinds of success for Montreal, and Max Pacioretty, who went to Vegas in exchange for him, having success there as well, right? And so there's I think maybe there's going to be a little movement where people are a little bit afraid to pay a substantial price, just bite the bullet, lose the guy. Even if that happens to some degree, teams will give assets to Seattle for protection. There's no way around that. But what you're talking about is an entirely different strategy altogether. I look at the Seattle list of who's going to be available, and Ryan Clark and Eric Duhacek do a great job of consolidating all 30 teams as options for Seattle. I start picking through that, and I think if I'm just picking a roster, well then, I know DeMelo and Stanley are a popular debate to have here. I'm taking Mason Appleton because there's so many good defensemen that I think are going to be available from here anyway, and not that many high-end forwards. And I think Seattle might run out of good forwards by the top 9 or so, and therefore Mason Appleton's more important to me. But what you're talking about, not to tell you your own idea, but I absolutely love it, is like that's the fantasy draft where you take 8 goaltenders early, and then you have something that everybody absolutely wants, and then you can make hay trading these prime pieces. And if Seattle decides that they want to make a run on defense or any position, just because they can then parlay those in terms of assets, maybe they clean up in terms of the number of draft picks they can get in future years. Maybe they can fill those holes on forward. I think that they are being built as an extremely creative, forward-thinking organization, and that they're going to go to that well. And what does that mean for Winnipeg? Who's going to end up on the market? I mean, I wish I'd researched this before, because that's fascinating. You may have just written an article.
Well, I mean, because the bottom line is with the Jets where they are right now defensively, I mean, I think you can make an argument. And again, you kind of have to, do a little bit of spitballing as to who will be protected. But there's a number of guys that might be on that list that, would be nice additions to this club. They're available. There might be a way to make a better decision an easier decision, I guess I should say, for Seattle, being an expansion team with a younger player that could come over as part of, potentially working on your own pick too. So I think that the creativity from the general manager side of things, once they have an idea about who's available, I feel, listen, Ron Francis is going to have a lot of time on the horn, I think, when he's fielding all his calls from respective general managers. Well, I may as well ask you this, because it's something that we talked about last week with Ken and a few other guys. We've touched on it a little bit, but let's just assume for a minute, Murat, that the Jets are protecting Scheifele, Wheeler, Ehlers, Connor, Dubois, Lowry, and let's assume that Andrew Kopp is signed and Andrew Kopp is protected as well, and he's the 7th forward, meaning Mason Appleton and Jansen Harkins from the forward group are exposed. And on the blue line with 3 defenders protected, let's assume that Morrissey and Neil Pionk are both protected, and then a decision comes down to Logan Stanley and Dylan DeMelo. And this is something we talked about throughout the year, and it's sort of changed. I mean, where are you at right now on who will and who should be protected from those two? And I guess to your point earlier, does it really matter? Because as long as Mason Appleton isn't exposed, is he the most likely player to be picked by Seattle?
Well, I would think that that's where it goes, is that Mason Appleton, if exposed, is the number 1 target available. And I think that you can look at the sort of minutes he's played over his career, think that, how do these players get better? Are they going to take major leaps in their development? At his age, I think he's 25. He may yet grow in terms of what kind of player he can become, though he is in the midst of what a lot of folks consider to be a modern day prime. But is he a player you can give a bigger role or more minutes to and project that the way he turns corners on defensemen and the way that he's willing to drive the net is this really productive, maybe not top line power forward, but impact guy. I think that there are reasons why teams might, or Seattle may find value in Mason Appleton beyond Winnipeg's defense available. I know people are trying to sort of galaxy brain the Seattle situation. Okay, well, we talk about how analytics is influencing how they're making decisions. Does that mean that they'd be more interested in Dylan DeMelo than Logan Stanley on the back end because DeMelo, analytics look great and Logan Stanley's actually look good, but the context is that he was sheltered like nobody else has been in Winnipeg for ages and ages. So there's a lot. It's fascinating because they're essentially opposite player types. Big, powerful, big hitting, catches your eye in all of the ways, scores the two, not a big offensive player, but scores these two important goals against Montreal, right? And then a player who's a little bit more up in years with, at 28 years old, I think it is, maybe he's 27, but DeMelo does subtle things that don't get noticed. So is a robot or a computer going to make this decision, or a hockey man, so to speak, or a hockey lady who has the experience and will probably be drawn to the big, powerful player? I think the answer comes down to, well, for Winnipeg, I think they're so invested in Logan Stanley, and you're the one who got me on this, that they're going to find a way to protect him because they've invested so much over the years. But I think that there's debate for that, even within the organization. I bet you there's room for debate on that front because there will be some who believe that he's a third pairing defenseman at 23 years old. 5 years after his draft day is when he broke into the NHL. And if you do the deep dive on that, defensemen who make the NHL 5 years after their draft day, there aren't a lot of top pairing, top four stars on that list. You can go through 100 names. I've been starting to do this. I've been doing the research on this. It is extremely, extremely rare for somebody to go make an NHL debut at 23 and then have a high end. You do get a couple of top four defensemen like Derek Forbort did it. Jamie Oleksiak is close, but mostly it's misses. And when you combine that with the fact that Logan Stanley never saw top six opposition this year, you can go through the minutes. They kept him so diligently and perfectly away from your Patersons, McDavids, and Matthewses of the world. At the end of the day, if you're Winnipeg, I think that you might have safety in saying, well, okay, we realize our hearts are in this guy. We believe in this guy. But what's going to make him so shiny to Seattle? He's our third pairing sheltered guy at 23 years old that we're going to have to risk too much in the way of assets there. I don't know. I don't think that's an expensive protection element for Winnipeg in terms of making sure that he stays safe.
Yeah, and a guy come back. I mean, the one thing that, if we're just looking at numbers and you don't see the player, I think you make a lot of great points. I just think that Stanley is such a unique player in that, you bring that size, his path was very different. And we knew that was the Jets' plan and thought on this player when he was drafted at 18. And they literally called their shot, said, oh, he's going to go back to junior for 2 years. Then he's going to play 2 years in the American Hockey League. And then we think he'll be ready. And that was this year, and he was ready for as much as they gave him so far. And I'll give them a lot of credit for the way they did handle him. I mean, maybe at times could he have used the opportunity to maybe show what he can do in a higher role? You could make the argument for that. But the bottom line is you want your young players to come into a position where they can be successful. And even on a blue line that had the issues the Jets did, the Logan Stanley was one of the great stories of the season, certainly on the blue line compared to, I think, what most people's expectations, and to be honest, even Maurice's expectations going into this season. When you saw him starting in the B group at the beginning of training camp, it didn't seem like he was a guy that was penciled in on that lineup. But to his credit, he went out and earned it. And I think he did a lot with the opportunity he was given. And that's a big reason why I think a lot of fans, a lot of people in the organization, as well as people outside, think that there might be some unique potential in a player like this that has a little bit of a different path to get to where he is right now in his NHL career.
Well, when you already see that he's late blooming, and when you look at such a unique, whatever the odds are that he takes that next step, when you just think of the toolkit that he comes with, well, then if he does take that next step, you start thinking, oh my goodness, what could that player be, right? And I mean, if he were of a different stature, if he had different uniqueness to his game, if he was a more boring player, let's say, and the ideal, he makes all of the steps version of him was less exciting than a 6'7" guy who has a little bit of puck skill as well. I mean, he's not just a bruiser. I know his size will get focused on forever. He can do a lot of things. I think that's what makes it so tantalizing for a lot of people. And I don't use the sheltered argument to say that he wasn't a success story, but just to try to keep it in context. Because for me, when you look at the quality of team and opposition impacts, like from an analytical perspective, top four, whether you're on the first or second pair, not a lot of difference in how that impacts an end of season, shot attempts, expected goals, et cetera, et cetera. But oftentimes it's that third pairing that can genuinely be sheltered and needs a great deal of caution in how we interpret how well this player played. So I think Winnipeg did a perfect job of protecting him, so to speak. It's what I wish would have happened for Sami Niku instead of a first pairing drowning that happened early on in the year. It's how you might ideally have liked Ville Heinola to come along. If Dylan Samberg makes the team next year, you might ideally like that. This is great sheltering. It's a perfect play. And it's great bench management as well in Stanley's favor. And to his credit, I think we're learning about him as a person too, the more media he does and the more that he talks to us. That I think that you really get the sense that this is a really consummate teammate. He sort of knows his role. He knows how to be a hockey player, so to speak, which is a really big cliche. But I guess what I'm trying to say, and I'm not trying to land on I protect him without doubt, because that's not how I feel. But I am trying to acknowledge there's lots of little things that you got to like about Big Logan Stanley.
Yeah, no, agreed on that. And yeah, it has made this discussion around the expansion draft a lot more interesting, considering, what I think we thought at the beginning of this very strange 56 game. I see Tracy saying Stanley's a pretty good passer, puck mover. I watch his passes on the tape clean, not too hard. And this goes back to, the puck management. I think a lot of people were really worried that, big, kind of awkward, this huge player that hasn't had the experience that, it would look like a hand grenade on his stick with the pin pulled. But, more often than not, he made those simple plays. And sometimes maybe that was credit to, the confidence he had in the player that he was playing with, which quite a bit this season was Dylan DeMelo. But there were a lot of things that he did very well in the opportunities that he was given. And I did say this going into the playoffs, Murat, and I know we spoke before about his propensity for just firing the puck and getting it on net. And we went a long time without it really generating into much. But I did say to a couple of the guys, if he keeps putting, particularly come playoff time, with the way that goals are scored and, it's not a lot of highlight, tic-tac-toe plays off the rush, I'm like, that's going to make a difference for the Jets at some point. And obviously it didn't get them a win in that final game, but when you do that well, get it on net that often, sooner or later, some good things are going to happen. And it finally happened for Logan Stanley in the last game that they played.
Yeah, I love that it was him. I absolutely love that, the team needing a push. That is this third pairing defenseman who not walked on. Obviously, he's a big part of the organization's plan, but I want to say walked onto the team in training camp, and he's scoring those 2 goals. I mean, I think Carey Price might have wanted one of them back. But it's what I think it's just part of the magic of the story that is hockey, right? I mean, like you were saying, even to reflect this idea right off the hop, when you're saying, well, maybe concerts feel special in that way of having lots of people together. I think what's special of having lots of people together around, say, the Winnipeg Jets or the Winnipeg Blue Bombers is all the fans know the story. Like, this is a story that when you get there, you know where Logan Stanley came from. You know how the Jets traded up to get him. You know how the Jets called their shot, like you perfectly illustrated. And so that when he gets to that moment, it's so much more satisfying, I think, for fans and so much more brilliant to watch because you know it in context. And I like that. I don't think he's going to explode into a major offensive player, but because I guess I just looked at his AHL numbers and his junior numbers, and they imply capable to me. Like, this guy does not handle the puck like it's a hand grenade, like you say. But I don't think that there's no one year where he just goes off with the kind of numbers that imply that he's going to be a real point producer at the NHL level. But it's just amazing that we're getting to this point in NHL history where we have a 6'7" guy in the third pairing who does move the puck as well as he does and can make a smart reverse pass and all of those sorts of things. I do want to say, if you're Dylan DeMelo and you end up exposed, or you're a team on the outside watching Dylan DeMelo getting extended for 4 years, 1 year, having a season where he is the only partner with whom Josh Morrissey has positive possession results and then gets exposed. Like, for me, that's not a great look either. So I don't know how Winnipeg negotiates its way out of that scenario necessarily, or what that play is. But I guess I'm just saying that to illustrate that there is a really compelling story for them to want to keep both players.
No, absolutely. And I think the smart money is doing exactly that. But what the cost is for that, whether you can just have that happen by exposing one of them and having Mason Appleton be selected, or maybe it's a couple prospects a pick. And, because I'm sure they'd love to keep Appleton too. I mean, that's the funny thing, Murat. We're sort of speaking with this focus on defense because of the issue the Jets have had on the blue line. You don't want to see them going backwards on this. But at the same time, I mean, we've spent a lot of time talking about Stanley just because it was so unexpected. The season Appleton had was somewhat expected. We saw the trend he was going in, and he absolutely had a career year and earned every single dollar and more that he did, being, the new guy in that Kopp-Lowry trio that, has been so successful year after year for the Winnipeg Jets and such an important role for Maurice.
Yeah, and I think one more year at $900K, am I wrong? I mean, that's a value contract if there ever was one in a flat cap environment, in a situation where Winnipeg is really starting to pay for its talent, right? This isn't Ehlers, Laine, and Connor on their ELCs during a playoff run, right? This is some big ticket money going to Winnipeg star players. And so a contract like Appleton's is valuable. This idea that he's taken a step forward now that he has the opportunity, that's a huge asset as well. The unique way he gets his points, because, if you're a defending team against the Winnipeg Jets, you don't really have to respect too many players' net drive or turning the corner or just bulldozing or bulldogging their way to that, near or far post, the way that you have to respect it coming from Mason Appleton. And I like variety within a team. I don't know if I can quantify the value of that, but I like when a team can get it done a bunch of different ways. So there's another point in Mason Appleton as a Winnipeg Jets favor. And then the other thing I like, because, it's such a human-driven sport too, is that I just remember training camp, he stapled himself to Adam Lowry. And I've been at low-level minor league sports tryouts in my own life where you can read the social structure of the team based on who's hanging out with who at a tryout, right? And with Appleton, there was this obvious job available on that third line. Jack Roslovic hadn't seized it. That was still a situation in limbo. Somebody had to do it. And at camp, he was never more than 10 feet unless he was put on a different line or a different group. But sharing the same sheet with Adam Lowry, he was there. After practice, he was there. Adam Lowry's running these little pick the puck off the wall and attack the net drills. Mason Appleton was never far away from that. And I think whether it was him driven, the opportunity driven, whether he just did it because it was fun or he was asserting it, there was never a doubt in my mind that this was a player who knew what opportunity was in front of him and was going to leave no doubt about his willingness to take it.
Oh, Murat, this has been so much fun. I will direct people to The Athletic, a piece on the weekend, the Jets mailbag part 1, some interesting questions about the media turning on the Jets and some other things about the captain and whatnot. People can read that for themselves. And I would imagine as it was dubbed part 1, there will be a part 2 coming out as well.
Absolutely right. I'll be pouring a coffee and finishing that right after we talk, and then we'll get that out to subscribers perhaps this afternoon, perhaps this evening. A lot of good questions, including more on Logan Stanley. A lot of the numbers in the back of my mind for that were because I've been researching stuff for that.
Well, wonderful. And, again, we have, we'll focus on these playoffs for the next couple of weeks and we get into the Stanley Cup final. But I mean, the offseason is already in full swing for many teams right now. And I imagine while we, the questions, the mailbag will have a lot to do with what has been just transpiring in the playoffs. A lot of it is about the intrigue about this expansion draft, about adding to the blue line, and that I'm sure will be your focus for the next month or so before we get the answers to some of these questions that we can talk about for hours together.
Yeah, we know they're trying. We don't know how it's going to happen, and that's a fascinating ball game to play in.
Murat, thanks so much for doing this, buddy. I always appreciate it. Really enjoy all the Jets coverage in The Athletic, and looking forward to seeing part 2 of the mailbag come out as soon as it's ready.
Beauty. Thanks so much for having me.
Great stuff. Murat Ates of The Athletic. Follow him on Twitter at Murat WPG or WPG Murat. Doing such a great job and one of our favorite guys to have come with us here on the program.